November 1950, Kapyong Valley, North Korea. The cold bit through everything. 30 degrees below zero. The kind of cold that made your breath freeze in the air before you could see it disappear. The kind of cold that turned spit into ice before it hit the ground. Private Kai Min-jun sat in a shallow trench, his fingers numb inside worn gloves. 22 years old. 5 months of war. 5 months that felt like 5 years. He pulled out a folded piece of paper from inside his jacket, close to his chest where body heat kept the ink from freezing. A letter from his brother. June was 19, just a kid really. Kai had tried to stop him from enlisting. Failed. Now June was somewhere south of here, part of a 60,000-strong force holding a defensive line that felt more like a prayer than a strategy. Kai wrote in the margins of June's letter, using a pencil stub he kept tied to a string around his neck so he wouldn't lose it. I have seen 7 Allied units retreat in 5 months. Tomorrow, the 8th unit arrives. They will run too. Everyone runs eventually. The ones who don't run are dead. He paused, looked up at the grey sky. Snow had stopped falling an hour ago, but the clouds promised more. 300,000 Chinese soldiers had crossed the Yalu River. The reports kept coming in, each one worse than the last. Korean units were being crushed, 60% casualties, 70%. Entire battalions disappearing in a single night. The defensive lines that had held for weeks were crumbling like wet paper. Kai tucked the letter back inside his jacket. He had survived this long because he understood the mathematics of war. When the enemy outnumbered you 5-1, you fought until you couldn't, then you retreated. When they outnumbered you 10-1, you retreated faster. Simple math, simple survival. The ground shook, not from artillery, from trucks. They were coming. Kai climbed out of his trench, boots crunching on frozen earth. Other Korean soldiers were emerging from their positions, curious, suspicious. They had learned to be suspicious of everything. 7 trucks rolled into the valley, canvas covered, moving slow over the rough terrain. Captain Hwang Tae-young walked past Kai's position. 35 years old, a man who had seen too much and still somehow kept his uniform pressed. Hwang had fought alongside American units for months. He knew their patterns, knew their tactics, knew, most importantly, when they would cut and run. Canadians, Hwang said to no one in particular. 700 of them. Kai watched as the trucks stopped. Men started climbing out. They wore different uniforms than the Americans. Red maple leaf patches on their shoulders. Their movements were calm. Not rushed, not nervous. One of them was smiling. Kai looked at his friend, Private Lee Young-ho. Lee had been fighting just as long, had seen just as much, but where Kai had become cynical, Lee had become a joker. Dark humor was how he survived. "They're smiling," Lee said. His voice carried something between disbelief and amusement. "Fresh meat doesn't know it's fresh meat yet." "Give them 3 days," Kai replied. "Maybe less." The Canadians started unloading equipment, methodical, organized. One of them, a sergeant by the stripes on his sleeve, walked toward the Korean positions. He was tall, maybe 28, 29 years old. His face had the kind of calm that made Kai immediately distrust it. The sergeant stopped a few feet away, pulled out a pack of cigarettes, extended it toward Kai and Lee. "Good morning," the sergeant said. His accent was strange, formal. He spoke slowly, carefully, like he was reading from a book. "We are here to fight alongside you." The Korean words came out clumsy, mispronounced, but the effort was there. Kai took a cigarette. Lee did too. The sergeant lit them with a silver lighter that somehow hadn't been lost or stolen or traded for food yet. The lighter was engraved with something, but Kai couldn't read it in the dim light. "I am Sergeant Owen McLeod," the man said, still in broken Korean. "2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. Kai nodded, didn't offer his name. What was the point? This sergeant would be gone within a week, dead or retreating, probably retreating. You speak Korean? Kai asked in English. His English was better than MacLeod's Korean. MacLeod smiled, pulled a small phrase book from his pocket. The pages were dog-eared, stained. I am learning, MacLeod said in English now. Seemed rude to come to your country and not try. Lee snorted, muttered in Korean, polite soldiers die first. MacLeod's smile didn't waver. Kai wondered if he'd understood. You fought the Chinese before? Kai asked. MacLeod nodded. A few times. And when they come at you, thousands of them, wave after wave? MacLeod looked genuinely confused by the question. We hold our ground, Lee laughed, not a happy sound, the kind of laugh that came from seeing too many promises broken. Everyone says that. Before. MacLeod's expression didn't change. He just nodded slowly, like Kai had said something interesting but not surprising. Thank you for the cigarette, MacLeod said. We will be neighbors, I think. Good neighbors help each other. He walked back toward his unit. Lee turned to Kai. Mishyoso, he muttered. Crazy. They'll learn. Everyone does. Kai didn't disagree. But then the Canadians started doing something strange. They started digging. Not normal digging. Not the quick, shallow holes soldiers dug when they expected to move soon. Deep digging. The kind of digging that said you planned to stay. The sound echoed across the valley, metal striking ice, metal striking rock, over and over, a rhythm like a slow heartbeat. Kai watched, cigarette burning forgotten between his fingers. The Canadians were digging trenches 6 feet deep. 6 feet. Lee stood beside him, watching the same thing. Why so deep? If the Chinese break through, they'll be trapped down there. Can't run from a hole that deep. Kai didn't answer, because he was thinking the same thing. Captain Huang approached. He had binoculars raised, watching the Canadian positions like he was studying an alien landscape. I fought with Americans for 6 months, Huang said quietly. They dig fast, shallow, always ready to move. Mobile warfare, that's the doctrine. He lowered the binoculars. These Canadians, they're digging like they're building a home. The sound of shovels on frozen earth continued. Some of the Canadians had started using pickaxes. Sparks flew when metal hit ice. The men took turns. When one tired, another stepped in. Their hands were bleeding through their gloves. Kai could see the dark stains, but they kept digging. By the second day, the trenches were deep enough that a man could stand in them and still have protection. The Canadians had created fighting positions that would be murder to assault, but equally difficult to escape from. Kai walked closer to their lines, not close enough to intrude, but close enough to see. They weren't just digging trenches. They were preparing fields of fire, cutting away brush, measuring distances, writing numbers in small notebooks. Sergeant MacLeod was crouched over a map, surrounded by other soldiers. Kai could see them marking positions, 47 of them, numbered and labeled, mortar target points. They were pre-sighting every possible approach, every avenue of attack. When the Chinese came in the dark, the Canadians wouldn't need to see. They would already know exactly where to aim. It was professional, thorough, the kind of preparation that took time, the kind of preparation you only did if you believed you'd be alive to use it. Lee came up beside Kai. I counted their ammunition. Each man is carrying 200 rounds. Standard is 150. 200 rounds, 50 extra bullets per soldier. That added weight, significant weight, but it also meant they expected to stay in position long enough to need every single round. No retreat, no pullback to resupply. Just dig in and hold. One Jonhi Maichoso, Lee said, completely crazy, but this time there was something else in his voice. Not quite respect, not yet. but the laughter had stopped. December bled into January. The days were brutal. Temperatures dropped to 40 below. Men lost fingers to frostbite. Supply lines froze solid. Food was scarce. Medicine scarcer. But the Canadians kept digging, kept preparing. Kai watched them work through the worst of winter. They sang while they dug. Happy songs, songs about home. Lee made jokes about it, but even his humor couldn't disguise the confusion. Who sang in a war zone? January became February. Small skirmishes, Chinese probes testing defenses. Each time, the Canadians held without retreating an inch. Kai watched, started to believe, though he fought against it. One night in February, McLeod invited Kai to share coffee. Real coffee somehow. They sat in the Canadian trench, the walls so deep they blocked the wind. "You think we're foolish," McLeod said. Not a question. Kai considered lying, decided against it. "Yes, this preparation, it's for nothing if you're dead. And running keeps you alive. Running keeps you alive to fight another day," McLeod nodded slowly. "I understand that philosophy, but here's what I believe. If we run from this valley, the Chinese will flank south. They'll surround 60,000 men. Those men will die." He paused. "Your brother is one of those 60,000 men, yes?" Kai went very still. "How did you—" "I listen when soldiers talk. June, 19 years old, your only family." McLeod sipped his coffee. "If we run, he dies. So we won't run." The words hung in the frozen air. February turned to March. The ice began to crack. The ground softened just enough to make the mud underneath treacherous. Intelligence reports piled up on Huang's desk. The Chinese were massing forces. Everyone knew the real attack was coming. By early April, the Canadians had been in position for 5 months. 5 months of preparation. 5 months of proving they meant what they said. The trenches were 6 feet deep. The firing lanes were cleared. The mortar points were mapped. Everything was ready. Early April brought warmer weather. 30 below became 20 below, then 15. The Canadians tested their artillery coordination, practiced their firing patterns, moved between positions in the dark until they could do it blind. Kai found himself studying their methods. Despite his skepticism, despite everything, there was something about their absolute certainty that fascinated him. Lee noticed. "You're starting to believe them." "No," Kai said. But it was a lie. April 23rd, 1951. The intelligence came at dawn. 5,000 Chinese soldiers, the 10th Battalion, moving into position beyond the hills. Attack expected within 24 hours. Huang called the senior soldiers together. Kai and Lee stood among them. "We've been offered permission to pull back," Huang said. His voice was carefully neutral. "Secondary positions, better terrain, easier to defend." He didn't say what everyone was thinking, easier to retreat from. "The Canadians?" someone asked. Huang's expression flickered, something like awe, something like disbelief. Sergeant McLeod tore up the retreat order, said if they left Hill 677, 60,000 men would die, said their trenches were dug, their fields of fire were prepared. He paused. "They're staying." The silence was heavy. 5,000 Chinese against 700 Canadians, Lee said quietly. "That's not courage, that's suicide." Kai thought about June, about what McLeod had said, about 5 months of watching men prepare like they meant to stay forever. "I'm staying too," Kai heard himself say. Everyone turned to look at him. "My brother is in the 60,000 south of here. If this hill falls, he dies, so I'm staying." Lee stared at him. "You've spent 5 months telling me running is smart." "I was wrong." Kai checked his rifle, made sure he had full ammunition. "Sometimes running just means someone else dies in your place." Li was quiet for a long moment. Then he checked his own weapon. Gudulan Jejongshini Anya, they're not in their right minds, and apparently neither are we. But he smiled when he said it. That afternoon, Kai sought out MacLeod, found him checking ammunition supplies one final time. 5,000 Chinese are coming, Kai said. You understand those numbers? MacLeod nodded. We've been briefed. And you're really going to stay in these trenches? That's the plan. Kai felt something shift inside him, something he'd thought was dead after 5 months of watching good men run and smart men survive. It felt like hope. And it terrified him. Why, he asked, why stay when you could live? MacLeod set down the ammunition box, looked at Kai directly. Those calm eyes, suddenly very serious. Because if we run, good men die, men like your brother, and I've run before, Kai, once. It's not something I'll do again. The darkness came fast that evening. Complete. No moon, no stars, just blackness so thick you could feel it pressing against your skin. And from somewhere beyond the hills, carried on the wind, Chinese bugles. The attack was beginning. Kai took a breath, held it, released it, slowly. Beside him, from the Canadian trenches, someone started singing. My Bonnie lies over the ocean, my Bonnie lies over the sea. Kai closed his eyes. Mishosa, he whispered. Then he opened his eyes, raised his rifle, and waited, because for the first time in 5 months, he wasn't planning to run. The bugles grew louder. Kai had heard that sound before, 6 times in 5 months. Chinese bugles meant one thing. The human waves were coming, hundreds of men charging at once. When the first wave fell, a second came, then a third, then a fourth. It didn't matter how many bullets you fired, more soldiers always kept coming. Most units broke after the third wave. It was the smart thing to do. It kept you alive. Kai crouched in his trench, rifle ready. His hands weren't shaking. That surprised him. 5 months ago, before his first battle, his hands had trembled so badly he could barely hold his weapon. Now they were steady, calm. The body learned what the mind couldn't accept. 20 meters to his left, the Canadian trenches were silent. No panic, no shouting, just quiet preparation. He could see their shapes in the darkness, moving with careful efficiency. Then he heard it again, singing, softer now, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. My Bonnie lies over the ocean. Li was in the trench beside Kai. Still singing, he muttered. Crazy until the end. But there was no mockery in his voice. Just wonder. The first wave hit at 8 p.m. exactly. The darkness erupted with sound. Bugles, whistles, thousands of voices screaming as one. And underneath it all, a sound like thunder rolling across the earth. Boots. Thousands and thousands of boots hitting frozen ground in rhythm. The Canadians held their fire. Kai could see the shapes now. Moving shadows in the blackness. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. It was impossible to count. They just kept coming. A tide of humanity that seemed endless. Still the Canadians waited. 100 meters, 70, 60. Kai's finger tensed on his trigger. Why weren't they firing? Had they frozen? 50 meters, exactly 50 meters. Fire! MacLeod's voice, calm, almost gentle. Every Canadian rifle and machine gun opened up at once. The world became light and noise and death. Vickers machine guns roared with a sound that made Kai's chest vibrate. 250 rounds per burst. The technical manual said that was the optimal rate of fire. But hearing it, feeling it, was different than reading numbers on a page. It sounded like the earth itself was tearing apart. Tracer rounds painted red and green lines through the darkness, every fifth round, showing the gunners where their bullets were going. The lines converged on the Chinese assault like luminous fingers pointing at prey. Men fell. Dozens, hundreds. The screaming changed pitch, became something worse. At 50 meters, every bullet found its mark. There was no missing, no wasted ammunition, just perfect mechanical execution. The first wave broke, retreated, left their dead behind. Kai fired his own rifle, methodical, aimed shots. His training took over. Breathe, aim, squeeze. The rifle kicked against his shoulder. A Chinese soldier dropped. Breathe, aim, squeeze. Another fell. He had fired maybe 10 rounds when the second wave came. No pause, no break to regroup, just immediate, relentless pressure. More bugles, more screaming, more boots hammering the frozen earth. The Canadians changed their firing positions, smoothly, like they'd practiced it 1,000 times, probably had. Men moved from one prepared spot to another, kept the Chinese from pinpointing exact locations, kept the enemy mortars guessing. Even under assault by thousands, they stuck to their plan, disciplined, calm, professional. The second wave died like the first. Kai's ears were ringing. The sound of the Vickers guns was so loud it hurt, constant, unrelenting, a mechanical roar that never seemed to stop. Between the waves, he heard it again, singing, quieter than before, strained, but still there. My Bonnie lies over the sea. Lee leaned over, shouted to be heard over the ringing in their ears. They're actually doing it. They're actually holding. Kai nodded. Words seemed inadequate. The third wave came 30 minutes later. By now, Kai had lost track of how many rounds he'd fired. His shoulder ached from the rifle's recoil. His hands were black with powder residue. The barrel of his weapon was hot enough that he could feel the heat through his gloves. The smell was overwhelming. Gunpowder, thick and acrid. It coated the back of his throat, mixed with the metallic taste of blood and the sharp scent of explosives. Every breath tasted like war. Captain Huang appeared beside Kai's position. His uniform was splattered with mud and blood, not his own, Kai hoped. They're not stopping, Huang shouted over the gunfire. 3 waves already. The Canadians haven't moved back an inch. I know, Kai shouted back. Some of our units are pulling back to secondary positions. We should... I'm staying, Kai interrupted. Huang stared at him. What? I'm staying. Kai worked the bolt on his rifle, ejected a spent casing, loaded a fresh round. My brother is in that 60,000 south of here. If this hill falls, he dies. So I'm staying. Lee nodded beside him. We're staying. Huang opened his mouth, closed it, then nodded slowly. Michioso, he said. But he smiled when he said it. All of us. Completely crazy. The fourth wave came. The fifth. By midnight, Kai had stopped counting. The pattern was always the same. Bugles, screaming, the human tide rushing forward. The Canadians waiting until 50 meters. Then the wall of fire. The mechanical slaughter, the retreat. The brief silence. And always, in that silence, the singing, Kai found himself listening for it, waiting for it. That soft melody between the waves of violence, it became a rhythm, attack, defense, death, song, attack again. It was 2:30 in the morning when the telephone line went down. Kai heard the Canadian radio man shouting. The line to the artillery battery had been cut. No more fire support. No more shells raining down on Chinese positions. Without artillery, the Canadians were just rifles and machine guns against 5,000 men. Kai saw Sergeant McLeod grab a coil of wire. Saw him start climbing out of the trench. "What are you doing?" someone shouted. "Fixing the line," McLeod replied, like it was the most normal thing in the world. You'll be killed. McLeod just smiled, that same calm smile, pulled himself up and over, disappeared into the darkness. Kai held his breath, counted seconds, listened to the occasional crack of rifle fire. The Chinese snipers were active, waiting for targets. 3 minutes later, McLeod dropped back into the trench. His jacket was torn, blood on his shoulder, but he was smiling. "Lines fixed," he said. The artillery started firing again, shells screaming overhead, impacting on Chinese positions with thunder that made the ground shake. That was the first time. The telephone line was cut 4 more times that night. 4 more times, Canadian soldiers climbed out of their trenches under fire, crawled through mud and darkness and death, fixed the wire, came back. 2 of them didn't make it back. Kai saw their bodies in the light of artillery flares, lying crumpled where they'd fallen. But the communication never stopped for more than a few minutes. The Canadians wouldn't let it. At 3 in the morning, something changed. The 6th wave came harder than the others, more coordinated, better organized. The Chinese had learned from their failures. Now they came in smaller groups, using cover, moving faster. They reached the Canadian trenches, hand-to-hand fighting, bayonets, rifle butts, knives, men grappling in the darkness, killing each other with desperate intimacy. Kai saw Chinese soldiers drop into the Canadian trenches, saw the flash of blades, heard screaming that wasn't from gunfire. The Canadians fought like devils, but the Chinese kept coming, kept pushing, started to overrun the eastern section of the defensive line. Then Kai heard McLeod on the radio. His voice was still calm, still steady, but there was steel underneath now. Fire mission, target 47. Charlie. A pause. "That's your position, Sergeant." "I know, fire anyway." "Sergeant, we can't." "Fire, now. That's an order." 10 seconds of silence. Then the shells came. Not on Chinese positions, on the Canadian trenches. Kai watched in horror as artillery rounds impacted directly on the eastern section. Explosions erupted where both Canadians and Chinese were fighting. The earth heaved, shrapnel screamed through the air. When the smoke cleared, the Chinese assault had broken. The survivors were retreating, running back toward their own lines, but Canadians had died too, killed by their own artillery. Kai could see bodies in the crater-pocked earth. McLeod had called fire down on his own position rather than let the Chinese break through. Kai grabbed his radio, keyed the transmit button. His hands were shaking now. "Captain Huang, do you copy?" Static. Then, "I copy. What is it?" "The Canadians just called artillery on themselves, their own position." He struggled for words. They're completely insane." "I know," Huang replied. His voice was quiet, awed. "But the hill is still ours." Kai lowered the radio, looked toward the Canadian lines through the smoke. 4 hours in, 6 more waves to come, and the Canadians were already calling artillery on their own heads. Kai noticed McLeod's movements were getting slower. The sergeant kept his left hand pressed against his side. Even in the darkness, Kai could see the dark stain spreading across his jacket. During a brief lull, Kai moved to the Canadian trench, found McLeod directing men to new positions. "You're bleeding," Kai said. McLeod shook his head. "Scratch. I'm fine." "That's not a scratch. The battle isn't over." McLeod's voice was steel. "I can die after. Right now men need orders. They need someone standing, so I'm standing." Kai understood then. McLeod wasn't just leading them. He was dying for them, had been dying since the artillery strike hours ago, but refused to stop until the hill was secure. It was the most terrifying kind of courage Kai had ever seen. "At least let me bandage it," Kai said. McLeod nodded, allowed Kai to wrap the wound. The cloth soaked through almost immediately. "Thank you," McLeod said. Then he went back to directing his men. 4 a.m., 6 hours of continuous fighting. The Canadian artillery had fired over 1,400 shells. The ground shook continuously. The smell of explosives was so thick, Kai could taste it on his tongue. Some of the Canadian machine gun barrels were glowing red in the darkness, visible heat signatures from firing so many rounds so fast. The metal was beginning to deform, but they kept firing. Wave 9, wave 10. Kai had lost count. His ammunition was running low. His ears had stopped ringing. Not because the noise had decreased, but because he couldn't hear properly anymore. Everything sounded muffled, distant. He was beyond exhaustion now. Moving on instinct. Muscle memory. His conscious mind had retreated somewhere deep inside. Only the training remained. Load. Aim. Fire. Load. Aim. Fire. He saw Lieutenant Claire Ashford, the Canadian medic, climb out of her trench. In the light of artillery flares, he watched her crawl to a wounded Chinese soldier. She gave him water, bandaged his wounds, then crawled back. 10 minutes later, she did it again. Different soldier, same care. "Why?" Kai shouted across the gap between positions. "Why help them?" Ashford looked up. Even at this distance, even in the darkness, he could see her expression, tired but determined. "Wounded men aren't soldiers anymore," she called back. "They're just hurt people who need help." Then she ducked as bullets cracked overhead. 5 a.m. 9 hours. The 11th wave came. The 12th. Lee was still beside Kai, still firing, still alive. They didn't speak anymore, didn't need to, just fought side by side in the darkness. At 6 a.m., through the smoke and chaos, Kai saw something across the valley, a Chinese officer, standing on high ground, watching the battle through binoculars. The officer lowered the binoculars. Even at this distance, Kai could see his face in the light of flares. Not angry, not frustrated, sad, like a man watching something beautiful and terrible at the same time. This was Colonel Zhang Wei, the commander of the Chinese 10th Battalion. He had sent 5,000 men against 700, lost thousands, gained nothing, not 1 meter of ground. But he wasn't looking at the hill with hatred. He was looking at it with something else. Recognition. This was how war should be fought. With honor. With courage. Win or lose, some things mattered more than victory. Zhang raised his hand. Bugles sounded, but this time the call was different. Retreat. All along the Chinese line, soldiers began pulling back, not running, not panicking, an organized withdrawal, disciplined. Zhang looked toward Hill 677, toward the Canadian positions. He brought his hand up in a salute, a formal military salute to an honorable enemy. In his trench, Sergeant McLeod stood. Returned the salute. Then Zhang turned and walked away, followed by his men. The shooting stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. Kai's ears rang in the sudden quiet. His hands were shaking. His whole body was shaking. Delayed adrenaline crash hitting all at once. He tried to stand. His legs wouldn't support him. He sat back down hard. Lee was crying, not sobbing, just tears running down his face, cutting tracks through the powder residue. "We held," Lee whispered. "We actually held." The sky was getting lighter. Dawn. April 25th, 1951. 14 hours. They had fought for 14 hours straight. Kai climbed out of his trench. His movements were slow, uncertain, like he'd forgotten how to walk. The battlefield looked like hell had opened up and spilled out onto the earth. Bodies. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Kai couldn't count, didn't want to count. They covered the hillside, Chinese soldiers frozen in the positions they'd died. Some had made it within meters of the Canadian trenches before falling. The snow was red, not pink, not light red, deep, arterial red. Blood had soaked into the frozen ground until it couldn't absorb any more. Lee walked beside him, silent now. The Joker had no jokes left. They walked slowly toward the Canadian positions. Their boots crunched on spent shell casings. They were everywhere, ankle-deep in some places, thousands upon thousands of brass cylinders glinting in the early morning light. They found Sergeant McLeod sitting on the edge of a trench. The sergeant was eating beans straight from a can. His hands shook so badly that half the beans fell before reaching his mouth. His left side was soaked with blood. But he was smiling. Around him, other Canadians were doing the same. Eating, drinking water. Acting like nothing unusual had happened. Like they hadn't just fought off 5,000 men for 14 hours. "How?" Kai asked. His voice came out as a croak. His throat was raw from breathing smoke. McLeod looked up. His face was black with powder residue, blood on his shoulder, blood on his side. But his eyes were calm. "How what?" he asked. "How did you not run?" McLeod shrugged, winced at the movement. "Where would we go? This is our hill." He offered Kai the can of beans. Kai took it, tried to eat. His hands were shaking as badly as McLeod's. Captain Huang came running up the hillside. He was crying. Kai had never seen Huang cry. "They're safe," Huang gasped. "The 60,000. They pulled back during the night, made it to secondary positions. They're safe." Kai felt his knees go weak. He sat down hard next to McLeod. June was safe. 60,000 men were safe. Because 700 Canadians had refused to move. "Casualties?" Lee asked quietly. 10 dead, McLeod said. His voice was getting weaker. 23 wounded. He looked out at the sea of Chinese bodies. They lost more than 2,000. 10 Canadians versus 2,000 Chinese. The math didn't make sense, couldn't make sense, unless you understood that these men had prepared for this, had known it was coming, had spent 5 months digging trenches and mapping fields of fire and practicing in the dark, had made a decision long before the first shot was fired that they would not move, and nothing, not fear, not casualties, not overwhelming numbers, had changed their minds. Huang pulled out his notebook, started writing with trembling hands. "What are you writing?" Kai asked. Huang looked up. His face was wet with tears. "Urineun hutuehesta, gudulan namatta," he said. "We retreated. They stayed." Not an accusation, not shame, just truth, spoken with wonder. Kai nodded slowly. Because it was true, the Koreans had retreated. It was the smart thing, the logical thing, the thing that kept you alive. The Canadians had stayed. It was the brave thing, the impossible thing, the thing that won battles and saved 60,000 lives. Both choices made sense, but only one choice changed the world. "Sergeant," Kai said, "I thought you were weak. You were too polite, too kind." McLeod looked at him, waited. "I was wrong," Kai continued. "You're polite off the battlefield, but on it." He switched to Korean. "Jonjangyese는 Agma. Devils on the battlefield." McLeod's smile widened. "I'll take that as a compliment." The sun was fully up now, clear, cold, beautiful. Hill 677 still belonged to the Canadians. Not 1 meter of ground lost, not one single meter. And somewhere south, 60,000 men were alive because 700 had decided that some ground was worth holding, some brothers were worth dying for. Kai sat next to McLeod in the weak morning sun, sharing beans from a can, surrounded by the aftermath of hell. And for the first time in 5 months, he understood what courage really meant. It wasn't about being fearless. It was about standing still when everything in you screamed to run. It was about trusting the man next to you more than you trusted your own survival instinct. It was about digging a hole 6 feet deep and deciding that you would fight from the bottom of it until someone dug you out. The Canadians had taught him that, and Kai would never forget. April 25th, 1951. Afternoon. The bodies were still there. The Canadians had asked for work details to begin clearing the battlefield, but it would take days, maybe weeks. There were too many. The frozen ground made digging graves nearly impossible. So the dead remained, a monument to what had happened on Hill 677. Korean soldiers came to see. Word had spread fast. 700 Canadians, 5,000 Chinese, 14 hours, 10 Canadians dead. They walked through the Canadian positions slowly, reverently, like pilgrims visiting a holy site. Kai watched them touch the trench walls, saw them stare at the shell casings piled waist-high, watched them look at the Vickers machine gun barrels that had melted from the heat of continuous firing. The metal had actually begun to flow, like candle wax, before finally seizing up. Lee stood beside him, quiet. The Joker had become a monk overnight. "We should tell them," Lee said finally. "Tell them what it was like." "Would they believe us?" Kai asked. "No, but we should tell them anyway." A young Korean private approached, maybe 18, fresh-faced, probably hadn't seen real combat yet. "How?" the kid asked. His voice was barely a whisper. Lee answered before Kai could. They prepared, they trained, they trusted each other, and when the time came, they didn't run. He paused. And neither did we. The young soldier looked at Lee, at Kai, seeing them differently now. Kai left them talking, walked toward where the Canadians were gathered around a small fire. They had coffee brewing, real coffee somehow. The smell cut through the stench of gunpowder and death. Sergeant McLeod was there. He had changed his jacket. The bloody one was gone, replaced with a cleaner one. But Kai could see how carefully he moved, how pale his face was, how his left hand kept returning to his side. "You need a doctor," Kai said. McLeod shrugged, winced hard at the movement. "Later? When there's time? Now, that wound is serious." "I'm fine." "Sergeant," Kai's voice was firm. "You're not fine. You're dying." Lieutenant Ashford appeared, took one look at McLeod and made a sound of disgust. "Sit," she ordered. Sit down now." McLeod sat. Ashford worked quickly, removed the makeshift bandage. The shrapnel wound was deep, ragged, the kind of wound that needed proper surgery, not field dressing. Infection had already started. Kai could see the red streaks spreading from the wound. "This needs a hospital," Ashford said. "We don't have a hospital," McLeod replied. "Then you need to rest. No moving, no walking, no giving orders." "We'll see." Ashford looked at Kai. "Help me get him to medical." Together they got McLeod into the medical tent, just a canvas shelter with cots on frozen ground. But better than nothing. McLeod's breathing was shallow, labored. His skin was hot to the touch. Fever. "Your brother," he said quietly, eyes closed. "June, he's safe?" "Yes," Kai replied, because of you." "Not just me, all of us." "But you led, you gave the orders, you called fire on your own position." McLeod opened his eyes, looked at Kai directly. "We made the decision together, long before the battle started. Every man in this battalion decided we would hold. I just spoke the words out loud." He closed his eyes again. His breathing was getting worse. Kai sat beside him, keeping watch. April 26th, 1951. The sound of trucks woke Kai from a sleep he didn't remember falling into. He was still sitting beside McLeod's cot, his back against a tent pole. The trucks were UN transports, carrying supplies, bringing reinforcements now that the immediate threat had passed. Kai stood, stretched. Every muscle in his body ached. Lee was outside, smoking. He'd found McLeod's silver lighter somehow, was turning it over in his hands. "He's getting worse," Ashford said quietly. She was checking McLeod's vitals. "The infection is spreading. We don't have the antibiotics we need." Kai nodded. Had known it was coming. Shrapnel wounds in the field. Sepsis. In 1951 it was a death sentence more often than not. One of the trucks stopped near the Korean positions. Men started climbing out. Soldiers who looked too clean, too rested. They hadn't been at Hill 677. Then Kai saw him. June, his little brother, 19 years old. Skinnier than Kai remembered, face dirty and tired, but alive, wonderfully, impossibly alive. June spotted Kai at the same moment. His eyes went wide. "Hyung!" he shouted. "Brother!" He ran. Kai ran. They met in the middle, colliding in an embrace that drove the air from Kai's lungs. June was crying. Kai realized he was crying too. "They said 700 Canadians saved us," June gasped. "Said they held a hill against 5,000 Chinese. Said it was impossible. Said it was a miracle." He pulled back, looked at Kai. "Were you here?" Kai nodded, couldn't speak. "Did you fight with them?" Another nod. June's expression changed, awe replacing relief. Lee appeared, extended his hand to June. "Your brother is a good soldier. He stayed when others left." June shook Lee's hand. "And you?" "I'm just crazy enough to follow him." Kai led them both to the medical tent. Showed June the man who had saved his life without ever meeting him. McLeod was awake, pale, but smiling. "Sergeant Owen McLeod," Kai said. "This is my brother June." June bowed, deep, formal. "The kind of bow you gave to someone who had saved your life." McLeod tried to sit up, failed, settled for nodding from where he lay. "Your brother is a good soldier," McLeod said, in his careful Korean. "He stayed when others left. He fought beside us. You should be proud." June looked at Kai, then back at McLeod. "You didn't save us," June said quietly. "You saved us together. All of you." McLeod's smile widened. "Yes, together." That night, Kai wrote in his journal for the first time in weeks. "I thought the Canadians were weak because they were polite, because they smiled, because they helped civilians and said please and thank you. I thought nice men didn't survive war. I was wrong. They showed me that you can be gentle in peace and unbreakable in war. That kindness is not weakness, that the quietest men sometimes make the loudest statements. On Hill 677, 700 Canadians spoke without words. They said, 'We will not abandon our brothers. We will not run from duty. We will stand when standing seems impossible.' And 60,000 men lived because they meant what they said." April 28, 1951. 3 days after the battle. 3 days of watching McLeod fight an infection his body couldn't defeat. Kai was checking ammunition supplies when he heard the shouting from the medical tent. Lieutenant Ashford was calling for help. Her voice was urgent, desperate. Kai dropped everything, ran. Inside the tent, McLeod lay on his cot. His breathing was wet, labored. The shrapnel wound had turned septic, blood poisoning. In 1951, in the field, with limited antibiotics, it was a death sentence. Lee was already there. June, too. They had all grown close to the sergeant in 3 days. The man who had saved 60,000 lives was dying, and they were powerless to stop it. Kai knelt beside the cot, took McLeod's hand. The sergeant's eyes were open, aware. He knew. "Kai," he whispered, "I'm here. Your brother. Still safe?" "Yes, because of you." McLeod shook his head slightly, winced at the pain. "Because we stood together, remember that, when you teach others. It wasn't one man, it was all of us, deciding together that some things matter more than fear." "I'll remember, I promise." "The hill. We held it?" "We held it, not 1 meter lost." McLeod smiled, that same calm smile Kai had learned to trust more than anything. "Good, that's good." His breathing became more shallow. Ashford worked frantically, but they both knew there was nothing to be done. "Sergeant," Kai said, his voice broke. Thank you for showing me what courage looks like. Thank you for teaching me to stand." McLeod's eyes focused on him one last time. "You already knew," he whispered. "You just needed someone to remind you." Lee stepped forward, placed something in McLeod's hand, the silver lighter. "For your journey," Lee said quietly in Korean. Then in English, "You are the bravest man I ever met." McLeod's fingers closed around the lighter. He looked at Lee, at June, at Kai. "Brothers," he whispered. "All of us, forever." His eyes closed. Sergeant Owen McLeod died at 3:47 p.m. on April the 28th, 1951, 3 days after holding Hill 677. 3 days after saving 60,000 men. He was 28 years old. Kai sat with the body for an hour. Then he walked outside, found Captain Huang. "I want to become an instructor," Kai said. "I want to teach what the Canadians taught me." Huang looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Yes," he said. "Yes. That would honor them properly." Lee joined them. "I want to teach too." Huang smiled. The skeptic and the joker, transformed by 14 hours on a frozen hill. "Yes, you'll both teach, and the world will remember." May 1951 through July 1953, the war continued, but something had changed. Chinese intelligence reports started circulating. Officers were told to avoid any position flying the Canadian flag. The red maple leaf became a warning sign. It meant soldiers who would not retreat, soldiers who would call fire on themselves rather than give ground. Smart Chinese commanders found easier targets. Korean soldiers started using a phrase. It spread through the army like wildfire. "Canada처럼 싸워, 사이나다 쏘, fight like a Canadian," or when a situation was desperate, when retreat seemed like the only option, when death seemed certain, officers would say it. "Fight like a Canadian, stand your ground, trust your brothers." Kai and Lee became instructors, taught new recruits the tactics they'd learned: deep defensive positions, pre-sighted fields of fire, discipline under pressure, trust in the men beside you. But more than tactics, they taught philosophy. Courage is not about being fearless, Kai would tell his students. Fear is irrelevant. Courage is about standing still when everything in you screams to run. It's about trusting your brothers more than your survival instinct. It's about deciding, before the battle even starts, what you're willing to die for. He taught them the Kapyong principles, not written in any manual, just lessons learned in blood and fire on a frozen hill. Prepare completely. Know your fields of fire. Stay calm under pressure. Trust your comrades. Do not retreat unless ordered. These principles had been written by 700 men who dug 6-foot trenches and sang before battle and called artillery fire on their own positions rather than abandon their post. The Korean War ended in 1953. Kai went home. Lee went home. June went home. They were among the lucky ones. But Kai never forgot Hill 677. and he kept MacLeod's silver lighter. A gift from Lee, who said he would want you to have it. You were his brother too. 1960s through 1990s. Kai became a senior instructor at the Korean Military Academy, taught officer candidates. Every class heard about Kapyong, about 700 Canadians who refused to move. He kept the story alive, made sure new generations understood what had happened on that hill. Lee became an instructor too, then later a teacher. He told the story to anyone who would listen. The Joker had found his purpose, keeping memory alive. June became a teacher, civilian life, married, had children. But he told the story too, to his students, to his kids, to anyone who would listen. The relationship between Canada and South Korea grew deeper, built on more than just politics or trade, built on blood, on shared sacrifice. When Canadian tourists visited Korea, locals often refused to let them pay for meals. "Your grandfather saved our country," they would say. "This is nothing compared to that." Business deals between Canadian and Korean companies carried a level of trust that seemed inexplicable to outsiders, but insiders knew. The trust went back to 1951, to a frozen hill where Canadians proved they would not abandon their Korean brothers. 2015. Lee Young-ho died of a heart attack. Peaceful, quick. At his funeral, his last words to his family had been, "Tell Kai I'll save him a spot on the hill." Kai spoke at the funeral, told the story one more time, about two skeptics who learned to believe, about singing in the darkness, about standing when everyone else ran. "Lee taught me to laugh in the face of fear," Kai said. "The Canadians taught us both to stand in the face of impossible odds. Together we learned what it means to be brothers." April 24th, 2021. Kai Min-jun was 92 years old, confined to a wheelchair. His body had failed him in ways his courage never had. June 89 pushed the wheelchair through the streets of Seoul. Both brothers had made this pilgrimage every year for 70 years. Neither would miss it. They arrived at the memorial, a stone monument in a place of honor, black granite, polished to a mirror shine, names carved deep into the surface, 700 names. Kai's eyes weren't what they used to be, but he didn't need to see well. He had memorized the location of one name in particular, Owen MacLeod, Sergeant, 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, KIRA, April 28, 1951. Korean school children were visiting, a field trip, maybe 40 of them, young, too young to remember the war. To them it was just history, but their teacher made them line up, made them bow to the memorial. And then she told them the story. Kai listened, smiled. The teacher got most of it right. When she finished, one brave student approached Kai's wheelchair. "Excuse me, grandfather," the boy said. Polite, respectful. "Were you alive during the war?" Kai nodded. "Did you know the Canadians, the ones who held the hill?" "I fought beside them," Kai said. The boy's eyes went wide. The other students crowded closer. "What were they like?" someone asked. Kai thought about MacLeod, about the singing, about men digging trenches 6 feet deep in frozen ground, about the calm in the face of 5,000 screaming enemies. "They were polite," Kai said. "They said please and thank you. They helped civilians, they shared their food with hungry children." The students looked confused. That didn't sound like warriors. "And on the battlefield," Kai continued, "they were unbreakable, unstoppable, the bravest men I ever knew. They taught me that you can be gentle in peace and a devil in war. That kindness is not weakness, that the quietest men sometimes make the loudest statements." A Korean official approached, carrying a small wooden box. "Mr. Kai," the official said, "we brought something for you from the Canadian government." He opened the box. Inside were two things. First, soil, dark, rich, earth from Hill 677. Second, a silver lighter, engraved, the same one MacLeod had used to light cigarettes in November 1950, the same one Lee had placed in MacLeod's hand as he died. Kai's hands shook as he reached for the lighter. June helped him. Together they held it. On one side, the original engraving was still visible, worn but readable, OM, for courage and faith. On the other side, someone had added new words in Korean, 우리는 후퇴했다, 그들은 남았다, 그리고 그들 덕분에 우리는 살았다. We retreated, they stayed, and because they stayed, we lived. MacLeod's family kept it all these years, the official explained. They said, when the time came, it should go home, to his brother. Kai closed his fist around the lighter, tears running down his weathered face. Thank you, he whispered. Not to the official, to MacLeod, to the 700, to the 10 who never came home. Thank you for teaching me what it means to stand. A convoy of vehicles arrived, Canadian flags on the doors. 3 elderly men climbed out. Veterans, in their 90s now, survivors of Kapyong. The Korean and Canadian veterans embraced, old men crying, holding each other like long-lost brothers, because that's what they were. Not allies, not friends, brothers, bound by something deeper than politics or nationality, bound by the hill that wouldn't fall. Present day, Korean Military Academy. A young officer stood at a podium, 25 years old, freshly commissioned as a lieutenant, teaching a class on defensive tactics. His name was Owen Min-jun, Owen MacLeod Min-jun. Kai had insisted on the name when his great-grandson was born. Over protests, over tradition, over everything, his first great-grandson would carry the name of the man who taught him courage, a Korean officer with a Canadian name, a living bridge between 2 nations, bound by blood. The Battle of Kapyong is required study, Owen said, not just for the tactics, though those are important, but for what it teaches us about the human spirit. He clicked to a slide, a black and white photograph, Canadian soldiers in a trench, smiling despite the cold, despite the fear, despite everything. 700 men held this hill against 5,000. They prepared completely, they trusted each other absolutely. And when the time came to stand, they stood, no hesitation, no doubt. He paused, looked at his students. My great-grandfather fought beside these men. He died last year at 93. Before he died, he told me something I want to share with you. The classroom was silent. He said courage is not about being fearless. He said the strongest men are not the ones who shout loudest. They're the ones who stand quietly when everyone else runs, who dig 6-foot trenches and sing songs before battle. Who would rather die than abandon their brothers? Another slide, the memorial in Seoul, 700 names. These principles, the Kapyong principles, are taught in 47 militaries worldwide, but they weren't written by generals or politicians. They were written in blood by 700 men who decided that some ground is worth holding, that some brothers are worth dying for. A student raised his hand. Sir, why do we still study a battle from 70 years ago? Owen smiled, his great-grandfather's smile. Because the world needs to remember that when everything seems lost, when the odds are impossible, when retreat seems like the only option, sometimes the answer is simply to stand, to trust the people beside you, to refuse to move. He held up a silver lighter, MacLeod's lighter. Kai had left it to him in his will. This belonged to Sergeant Owen MacLeod, the man I'm named after. He used it to light cigarettes he shared with Korean soldiers he'd just met. 3 months later, he used it one last time before calling artillery fire on his own position rather than let that position fall. Owen set the lighter down carefully on the podium. We call Canadians our blood brothers, not because we have to, not because of politics, but because on a frozen hill in April 1951 they proved that brotherhood transcends nationality. that some bonds are forged in fire and never break. The class ended. Students filed out. But they walked differently, carried themselves with a little more pride, a little more purpose. The story lived on. 2023, April 23rd, Kai Min-jun died in his sleep, one day before the 72nd anniversary of the battle. At his funeral, the Canadian ambassador spoke, Korean generals spoke, his children and grandchildren spoke, but the most powerful moment came when a recording was played. Kai's voice, recorded years earlier for a documentary. I thought the Canadians were weak. I was wrong. They taught me that the strongest men are not those who never feel fear. They're the ones who feel fear and stand anyway, who know the cost and pay it willingly, who understand that sometimes standing still is the bravest thing you can do. A pause in the recording, the sound of an old man crying softly. 70 years later, when I close my eyes, I can still hear them singing. Between the waves of Chinese soldiers, between the artillery strikes, in the darkest moments, they sang. And that song taught me that hope is not foolish, that brotherhood is not weakness, that 700 men really can stand against 5,000 if they decide that the ground beneath their feet matters more than their fear. The recording ended. In the silence that followed, a young Korean soldier stood, then another, then another. Soon the entire chapel was standing, not at attention, just standing, quietly, the way the Canadians had stood on Hill 677. The Canadian ambassador stepped forward, placed MacLeod's silver lighter on Kai's casket. "He wanted you to have this," the ambassador had said when giving it to Kai in 2021. Now it would travel with Kai on his final journey. June reached out, touched the lighter one last time, remembered his brother, remembered MacLeod, remembered 14 hours that changed the world. "Hyung," he whispered, "you can rest now. We'll remember. We'll always remember." Outside the chapel, the cold wind blew, and on that wind, if you listened very carefully, you might hear 700 voices singing, not sad, not mournful, happy songs, songs about home, songs that reminded us that courage doesn't shout, it stands quietly, it digs deep, it refuses to move. 700 men proved that on a frozen hill in April 1951. One young Korean soldier learned it and spent 70 years making sure the world never forgot. And 72 years later, in a military academy classroom, his great-grandson, carrying the name of the sergeant who taught him what brotherhood means, was teaching it to the next generation. The hill that never fell, the brothers who never ran, the bond that death itself could not break. Forever.